My name is Adelaide Morgan. At 32, I was the unseen architect behind the highest-grossing arena tour of the decade. If you attended a pop concert in the last 3 years and felt the bass rattle your ribs while a laser grid painted the sky, you were standing inside a world I built. But my family never cared about my worlds. Tonight, 50,000 strangers stood on their feet at Madison Square Garden. The music stopped. The arena went pitch black. A single white spotlight cut through the dark and landed on me at the soundboard. 50,000 people screamed my name. 3,000 miles away in California, my father was watching the national broadcast from his living room. He picked up his phone and called me for the first time in 11 years. He left a voicemail. I did not listen to it. I pressed delete and went back to work. How we got to that moment, what it cost my brother Julian to put me in that spotlight, and what it cost my parents to realize they had bet their entire lives on a fraud, is a story about the lies families tell to keep themselves comfortable. Welcome back to QT Told Stories. If you have ever been the invisible child in your own home, this story is for you. Take a moment to subscribe, drop a comment, and let me know how old you are and where you are listening from right now. Let me take you back 15 years to the quiet auditorium where I first learned the price of admission to my family. I was 17. The stage lights were cooling down, making that distinct ticking sound hot metal makes in an empty room. The high school state championship theater production had just wrapped its final act. I had designed the entire lighting grid from scratch. It took me 3 months of staying late, climbing catwalks, and running cables. I sat in the third row staring at 2 specific vacant chairs in the middle aisle. My parents had promised they would be there. They promised they would leave work early. I walked home in the dark. My mother, Sylvia, was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of white wine. She did not look up when the front door shut. I asked her why they did not come. She sighed, setting the bottle down on the granite counter with a dull thud. "Don't be so needy, Adelaide. We can't be everywhere." But they could be everywhere for Julian. My older brother was 19 at the time. He spent his weekends playing amateur DJ sets in half-empty strip mall bars using borrowed equipment. My parents attended every single one. My father, Richard, a man who treated a tank of gas like a luxury expense, would drive 40 minutes across town to stand by a sticky bar, nodding along to pre-recorded tracks. Julian is a visionary, my mother would tell her friends on the phone. He has the creative spark. I went upstairs to my bedroom that night. I pulled a cardboard shoebox from under my bed. Inside were honor roll certificates, science fair ribbons, and a letter from the State Drama Board commending my lighting design. I folded the night's playbill in half, placed it inside, and put the lid back on. The Morgan family had a strict narrative. They had room for one genius, and they had already cast Julian in the role. He got the applause. I got the shoebox. I decided right then that I would stop asking for their attention. I would simply put my head down, learn my trade, and build things that worked. What I did not know was that 15 years later, Julian's manufactured genius would run out of runway, and he would come crawling to me to borrow my brain. Fast forward to today. I am 32 years old, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Oakland, California. I work as a live event production designer. In the industry, they call my specific role a ghost architect. When a touring artist steps onto a stage, the audience sees the magic. They see the sweeping beams of light, the synchronized video walls, and the seamless transitions that make an arena feel like an intimate club. They do not see the math. My job is the math. I calculate the precise load-bearing capacity of the overhead rigging. I design the power distribution networks required to run 300 motorized fixtures without blowing a city grid. I map the focal depth of the LED screens so a fan in the highest nosebleed seat still gets a clear picture. I spend my days staring at dual monitors, manipulating complex engineering software, and drafting structural blueprints. My name never goes on the promotional posters. I have always preferred it that way. The work itself is the reward. I find peace in the geometry of a well-designed stage. My brother Julian took a different route. 3 years ago, he moved to Los Angeles to launch a boutique production agency. He branded himself as a visionary creative director. His social media feeds are a curated exhibition of his assumed success. He posts photos of VIP backstage lanyards, expensive dinners at exclusive restaurants, and vague inspirational quotes about the creative process. He takes selfies pointing thoughtfully at empty arenas, wearing designer jackets that cost more than my monthly rent. Here is the reality of Julian Morgan. He cannot read a basic architectural draft. He does not know the difference between a lighting universe and a standard power cable. If you asked him to program a simple 3-point stage wash, he would stare at the control console as if it were an alien artifact. His entire agency operates on a singular, hollow business model. He networks. He schmoozes. He makes grand promises to managers and artists. Then, he relies entirely on my uncredited labor to build the pitch decks that keep his facade intact. This dynamic is fueled by a steady stream of blind validation from our parents. We share a family text message thread. I use the word share loosely. I am frequently removed from the conversation and added back only when my mother needs a head count for a holiday dinner. Most days, the chat functions as a dedicated fan club for Julian. Sylvia and Richard send strings of clapping emojis in response to every mundane update he posts. They praise his hustle. My mother frequently types paragraphs about how proud she is that her son is conquering a tough city. When I occasionally mention a successful project I have completed, the responses are brief. A simple thumbs up icon. A polite note saying, "That sounds nice." Then the conversation immediately pivots back to Julian's latest networking event. I pay my own rent in Oakland. I buy my own groceries. I funded my own software certification courses. Julian, meanwhile, drives a leased Porsche SUV. He tells his followers his boutique agency is backed by anonymous angel investors. I know my parents' financial history. I know my father spent 30 years managing a mid-tier logistics branch, and my mother worked as a dental hygienist. Angel investors do not usually require you to co-sign a lease on a luxury vehicle. I suspected early on that the bank of mom and dad was keeping the visionary afloat. I never brought it up. It was not my business. I kept my head down and focused on my screens. The arrangement survived because I allowed it to survive. I absorbed the inequity because it was easier than fighting a battle I was destined to lose. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, the scale of his delusion shifted. Julian called me. I was in the middle of routing a complex cable path for a regional festival. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I had the bandwidth to talk. He opened the conversation with the breathless, frantic energy of a man who had just struck gold. He told me he had secured a preliminary meeting for a national pop tour. He withheld the artist's name, wanting to build the suspense, but he emphasized the scope of the project. 40 arena dates, a multi-million-dollar production budget. It was the kind of contract that elevates an agency from a localized vanity project to a serious industry player. "I need you to whip up some visual concepts," he said. His voice was casual, drifting over the background noise of a busy coffee shop. "Just a few rendering files, maybe a 3D stage walkthrough. Keep it edgy, but scalable. I have the pitch meeting next Thursday, so I need the files by Monday night. Consider it a family favor." I stopped typing. Whip up some visual concepts. In my profession, building a scalable 3D stage walkthrough for an arena tour requires mapping out the physical dimensions of multiple venues. It requires calculating sightlines, rendering high-resolution textures for video walls, and ensuring the proposed structures obey the laws of physics. It is not something you whip up over a weekend. It is a grueling, highly specialized process. Legitimate management firms pay tens of thousands of dollars to commission that exact level of work. I sat at my desk, looking at my monitors. The cursor blinked on a structural wireframe I was already behind on. The familiar, suffocating weight of compliance settled over my shoulders. For 15 years, my primary survival strategy in the Morgan family had been to perform the silent labor required to keep the peace. I swallowed the frustration. I told him I would see what I could do. He laughed. He told me I was the best sister in the world. Then he hung up before I could ask a single technical question about the stage dimensions. The phone screen faded to black. I picked the device up and set it down again. I stared at the dark reflection of my own face in the glass. Something deep inside me shifted in that quiet room. This was not another local nightclub pitch. This was not a regional festival where the stakes were low. This was a national stadium tour. Julian was preparing to walk into a boardroom with high-tier music executives. He was going to present my specialized engineering as his own casual brainstorming. I knew exactly what would happen if I gave him those files. He would walk into that meeting holding a sleek tablet. He would swipe through my high-resolution renders, pointing out the elegant curve of the lighting truss or the innovative placement of the subwoofers. The executives would nod, impressed by the polish. Then, a production manager would ask him a basic question about rigging weight limits or power phases. Julian would smile his practiced, empty smile and throw out a salad of meaningless industry buzzwords. He was walking into a room full of veterans, wearing a suit made of paper, expecting the lights to keep him hidden. The injustice of it tasted bitter. Legitimate designers spend a decade carrying road cases and coiling dirty cables just to earn a seat at that table. Julian was bypassing the line entirely, using my calloused hands to open the door. He expected me to be grateful for the opportunity to serve his ambition. My mother's voice echoed in my memory from that empty high school auditorium 15 years ago. "Don't be so needy. Let your brother have his moment." I had spent my entire adult life making myself small so my brother could stand tall. I had given away my time, my expertise, and my credit to protect a mythology that excluded me. But staring at the blank screen of my phone, a tiny, irreversible fracture formed in my willingness to play the ghost. The audacity of his entitlement felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. He was not just asking for a favor. He was asking me to architect his entire future, to build the very foundation of his success, while I remained hidden in the background, unpaid and unacknowledged. I opened a new project file on my workstation. I titled the folder with his name. I began to pull structural assets from my personal library, dragging and dropping steel beams and lighting fixtures into the empty digital void. My fingers moved across the keyboard with ingrained precision, but my mind was unusually quiet. The old habit of seeking my family's approval was finally beginning to lose its grip. The fracture had started. And once a foundation begins to crack, it is only a matter of time before the whole structure comes down. I spent the next 3 nights awake in my Oakland apartment, illuminated only by the harsh glare of my dual monitors. The task Julian requested was not a simple sketch. To build a credible stage concept for an arena, you have to respect the geometry of the space. I drafted a sprawling, multi-tiered platform utilizing a central LED halo that could descend during the performance. I calculated the suspension limits. I mapped out the safe weight loads for the overhead rigging. I designed a cantilevered lighting array that looked sleek, but adhered to strict engineering safety codes. I poured my decade of specialized expertise into a digital file. I named the file Julian Concept Draft Version 1. It was a stunning piece of architecture. It was functional, elegant, and unmistakably my work. On Monday morning, I exported the initial structural wireframes and a few basic visual renders. I attached them to an email and sent them to my brother. I included a very precise, unmistakable disclaimer in the body of the message. I wrote, "This is a rough structural framework. It is strictly a proof of concept. It is not formatted or authorized for commercial pitch presentations. Do not distribute this without a formal technical review." I pressed send. 10 minutes later, Julian replied with a single thumbs-up icon. He did not say thank you. He did not ask any follow-up questions about the physics of the design. 7 days passed. I returned to my standard workload, drafting power grids for a regional corporate summit. I assumed Julian had taken my wireframes, realized they required actual technical literacy to explain, and quietly passed on the stadium project. I underestimated the sheer audacity of a man who had never faced a consequence in his adult life. On a Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed on my desk. It was a notification from the Morgan family group chat. Julian had uploaded a link, followed by 3 champagne glass emojis. The accompanying text read, "Your boy just landed the biggest fish in the ocean." I clicked the link. It directed me to a digital press release from an elite music industry publication. The headline announced that pop icon Serena Vale was launching her highly anticipated summer stadium tour. Serena Vale was not a mid-level artist. She was a global entity, an artist known for executing rigorous, high-budget spectacles. Below the headline was an exclusive preview of her upcoming stage design. I stared at my screen. My breathing slowed. The image featured in the article was my exact rendering file. The central LED halo, the multi-tiered performance platforms, the cantilevered lighting arrays. It was my intellectual property, copied and pasted into a global press release. The only difference was located in the bottom right corner. Julian had slapped a sleek, modern watermark over my foundation. It read, "Creative Direction by Morgan Boutique Agency." He had stolen my blueprint. He did not use it as inspiration. He did not use it as a structural guide. He took my proprietary file and sold it to one of the most powerful management teams in the music industry as his own original creation. I picked up my phone and opened a private message to Julian. My fingers tapped the glass screen with cold precision. I wrote, "That is my exact rendering file in the press release. You put your logo on my architecture without my permission." His reply appeared 3 minutes later. The tone was dismissive, dripping with the careless entitlement our parents had spent 30 years cultivating in him. He typed, "Chill out, 80. I tweaked the color grading to make it industry ready. The client loved the vibe I pitched. "We are a team." Tweaked the color grading. He had applied a standard digital filter to a complex architectural file and convinced himself he had designed a stadium tour. He was selling my gravity as his magic. I sat back in my chair. A familiar heat rose in my chest. I prepared to call him. I planned to demand he retract the image and inform the publication of the correct authorship. Before I could locate his contact card, my phone rang in my hand. The caller ID displayed my father's name, Richard. My father rarely initiated phone calls. He preferred the safety of passive text messages or routing his communication through my mother. When I answered, his voice lacked its usual detached rhythm. He sounded strained, talking fast, tripping over his own sentences. He asked me a convoluted question about corporate banking regulations and routing numbers for new limited liability companies. I frowned, looking away from the stolen rendering on my monitor. I asked him why he needed advice on corporate financial filings. My father managed regional trucking logistics. He had no business dealing with corporate entity formation. Richard hesitated. The silence stretched across the line, heavy and uncomfortable. Then the truth spilled out in a nervous, hurried rush. He told me that Julian had encountered a temporary cash flow issue regarding the Serena Vale contract. To secure the position as lead creative director, Julian's agency needed to demonstrate substantial financial backing. He needed to lock in upfront vendor deposits for the lighting suppliers and the staging manufacturers before the management firm would release the official production budget. My father cleared his throat. He said your mother and I decided to help him cross the finish line. We refinanced the house Adelaide. We took out a $200,000 second mortgage. The air left my lungs. $200,000. I knew the exact layout of their modest suburban home. I knew they had spent the last 28 years paying off their primary mortgage so they could retire comfortably. They had traded their entire safety net, their 30-year foundation, for a company built on a stolen PDF file. "It is an investment," my father continued, his voice adopting a defensive edge. He was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. "Julian is playing in the big leagues now. We had to back him. You have to spend money to make money in Los Angeles. He will pay us back tenfold when the tour kicks off." I closed my eyes. The reality of the situation locked into place like the steel pins of a heavy stage truss. Julian did not have a real agency. He did not have angel investors. He was funding his leased Porsche and his designer wardrobe by slowly draining our parents' bank accounts. Now he had convinced them to gamble their house on a contract he was technically incapable of fulfilling. The trap snapped shut around me. I looked at the private message I had drafted to Julian, the one threatening to expose his intellectual property theft. I deleted it. I could not send it. If I contacted Serena Vale's management team and proved the stage design was stolen, they would terminate Julian's contract immediately. Legitimate artists do not tolerate fraud in their production pipeline. The moment the contract evaporated, the vendor deposits would be lost. The $200,000 would be gone. My elderly parents would face instant bankruptcy. They would lose their home. I was cornered by my own competence and their reckless favoritism. Julian knew exactly what he was doing. He knew I would not blow the whistle if it meant putting our mother and father on the street. He was holding their financial survival hostage, using my code as the ransom. I told my father I had to get back to work. I ended the call. The silence in my apartment felt entirely different now. It was no longer the quiet of a focused workspace. It was the quiet of a ticking time bomb. Julian had secured the contract of a lifetime, but he had no idea how to build the stadium he had just sold. The tour was scheduled to begin physical rehearsals in 2 months. Eventually, someone on Serena Vale's technical team was going to ask him to explain the load-bearing math. He would fail. The illusion would shatter, taking my parents down with it. I opened the master file of the stage design. I stared at the central LED halo. Julian had forced my hand. I could not expose him yet, but I also refused to let him walk away with my legacy. I needed to let him build his paper castle just a little higher, knowing I held the only match that could burn it down. 3 weeks after the initial press release, Julian collided with a wall he could not charm his way over. Selling a conceptual rendering to a management firm is a performance. Building that concept into a physical touring structure requires geometry, physics, and electrical engineering. Julian possessed none of those specialized skills. The tour was transitioning from the visual phase to the logistical phase. The people writing the checks wanted to know how a floating LED halo would be powered without destroying the venue transformers. They wanted safety specifications. They wanted weight calculations. Julian was suffocating under the heavy burden of his own fabrication. He needed my brain in the room. He could not ask for my help honestly, so he orchestrated a performance for our parents. A notification popped up in the Morgan family chat on a Thursday morning. Julian wrote that he was heading into a crucial vendor meeting with Serena Vale's management team in Los Angeles. He added that he was going to fly me down and let me sit in. He typed that it would be a great opportunity for his little sister to see how the big leagues operate. My father replied with an emoji of a gold trophy. My mother typed a long paragraph praising Julian for his generosity, calling him a true leader who always looked out for his siblings. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated with a private text from Sylvia. It was not a message of encouragement. It was a strict set of instructions. Dress simply, Adelaide. Do not wear anything that draws attention. Sit quietly, take notes if he asks you to, and let Julian do the talking. He has worked very hard to cultivate these relationships. Do not get in his way. I packed a muted gray suit and booked a flight to Burbank. I was not traveling to Los Angeles to learn about the industry. I was traveling to protect a $200,000 mortgage that rested entirely on my brother's precarious shoulders. The meeting took place in a glass-enclosed conference room on the top floor of a Century City high-rise. The space smelled of cold air conditioning, expensive leather, and serious money. Serena Vale's management team occupied one side of the long mahogany table. They were formidable people. Lawyers, tour promoters, and financial directors who managed millions of dollars a day. At the far end of the table sat Marcus. He was a veteran production manager with salt and pepper hair and the calloused hands of a man who had spent 3 decades loading steel before moving to the executive tier. He did not smile. He analyzed. Julian sat at the center of the opposite side. He wore a tailored linen jacket and a confident grin, projecting the aura of a relaxed visionary. I sat in a sleek chair against the back wall, physically removed from the main conversation. I was the prop. I wore my gray suit. I held a blank notepad. I became invisible. For the first 40 minutes, Julian excelled. He clicked through the slideshow of my architectural renders, talking about mood vibe and emotional resonance. He used phrases like immersive experience and paradigm-shifting aesthetic. The financial directors nodded. The promoters loved the visual flair. Julian was in his element, selling the sizzle. Then Marcus leaned forward. The veteran production manager did not care about the vibe. He cared about gravity. Marcus tapped a silver pen against his notepad. The hollow metallic sound cut through Julian's monologue. Marcus pointed to the central LED halo displayed on the projection screen. He asked a very direct question. He wanted to know the total static weight of the center rig and how Julian planned to distribute that load across the standard grid of a 20-year-old basketball arena. Julian froze. His grin remained in place, but the muscles around his eyes tightened. He adjusted his linen jacket. He cleared his throat. He offered a vague assurance about utilizing modern rigging techniques and outsourcing the liability to top-tier steel vendors. Marcus did not blink. He asked about the power draw. He stated that the lighting array shown in the render would require at least 400 amps of three-phase power. He asked if Julian had factored in the cable gauge and the voltage drop for the secondary truss positions. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted from warm to frigid. The financial directors stopped nodding. They looked at Julian. Julian looked at the projection screen, his mind racing to find a buzzword that could substitute for a mathematical equation. He found nothing. He was drowning in a glass room. Julian turned his head and looked at me sitting against the back wall. His eyes held a brief flash of sheer panic, instantly masked by a practiced pivot. He gestured toward me with a casual flick of his wrist. He told the room that he preferred to keep his creative focus on the big picture. He said he brought his tech assistant along to handle the granular data. He smiled at Marcus and said Adelaide could walk them through the routing specifics. I stood up. I did not rush. I walked to the edge of the mahogany table, keeping my posture neutral. I did not look at my brother. I looked directly at Marcus. I answered the question. I kept my voice clinical and precise. I explained that the central halo was designed using modular, lightweight carbon framing rather than traditional aluminum trussing, reducing the static weight by 30%. I detailed the motor plot, specifying 2-ton hoists utilizing a bridle configuration to distribute the load across multiple structural I-beams in older venues. I addressed the electrical concern without missing a beat. I outlined a decentralized power distribution strategy, placing intelligent relay racks directly in the catwalks to eliminate long, heavy cable runs from the arena floor. I spoke for 4 straight minutes, delivering raw, unassailable engineering facts. I provided the exact voltage variables. I listed the specific data protocols required to sync the visual elements without latency. The tension in the room evaporated, replaced by the distinct quiet that follows undisputed competence. The financial directors relaxed their shoulders. The lawyers returned to their notes. Marcus stopped tapping his silver pen. He looked at me. He did not look at my gray suit or my quiet demeanor. He looked at my mind. He recognized a fellow builder. He gave a single, slow nod of approval. Before Marcus could ask a follow-up question, Julian stepped smoothly back into the spotlight. He clapped his hands together, producing a sharp, cheerful sound that reclaimed the room's attention. He praised my breakdown, calling it a perfect summary of his team's strategy. He told the executives that he pushed his staff hard to ensure his visions were executed flawlessly. He swallowed my expertise whole and wore it as his own accomplishment. The meeting concluded an hour later. Handshakes were exchanged. The promoters congratulated Julian on a brilliant presentation. My brother soaked in the praise, his charm fully restored now that the threat of technical scrutiny had passed. I remained by the back wall, gathering my blank notepad. As the executives filed out the glass doors, Marcus lingered near the presentation screen. He was packing his briefcase, but his eyes tracked the dynamic between Julian and me. He watched my brother walk out ahead of me, not holding the door, not offering a single word of thanks. Marcus saw the ghost in the machine. He saw the architect standing quietly in the shadow of the salesman. He said nothing, but a seasoned production manager knows that a man who cannot calculate a load limit did not design a carbon-frame stadium rig. I followed Julian into the bright Los Angeles sunlight. We walked toward his leased Porsche in the parking garage. I expected him to ignore what had just happened. I expected him to boast about his successful pitch. Instead, he stopped by the driver's side door and reached into his leather messenger bag. The panic he felt in that boardroom had terrified him. He realized my knowledge was a liability if he could not control it permanently. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled paper. He held it out to me. The engine of his ambition had survived the meeting, but he needed to lock me in the trunk before the car drove any further. The midday Los Angeles sun hit the concrete parking structure with a blinding glare. Julian stopped beside the driver's side door of his leased luxury vehicle. He unzipped his leather messenger bag. The artificial charm he wore inside the boardroom was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, transactional urgency. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled paper and a plain white envelope. He shoved them toward my chest. I took the documents. The top page featured heavy legal jargon, but the header was unmistakable. It was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. I flipped through the pages. The clauses were ironclad. They demanded the complete transfer of all intellectual property, prohibiting me from ever claiming credit, discussing my involvement, or using the designs in my own professional portfolio. Julian tapped the white envelope. He told me there was a cashier check inside for $5,000. He called it a generous bonus for stepping up and helping the family. $5,000. The total production budget for Serena Vale's tour hovered around $18 million. Julian stood to make a creative director fee well into the seven figures, plus a percentage of the gross merchandising revenue tied to the stage visuals. He was offering me a fraction of a percent to permanently erase my name from my own architectural masterpiece. He needed me legally silenced before I could realize my own leverage. I looked at my brother. He checked his expensive wristwatch, feigning impatience. He told me to sign the back page, date it, and overnight it to his attorney by Friday. He said our parents were thrilled that we were finally working as a cohesive unit. He used their pride as a weapon, assuming the weight of their expectations would force my compliance. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or throw the envelope back in his face. Years of navigating his manufactured reality had taught me that showing emotion only gave him ammunition. I folded the contract in half, slid it into my tote bag, and walked toward the rideshare pickup zone without saying a single word. My flight back to Northern California was quiet. Looking out the small oval window at the sprawling grid of the city below, I thought about the sheer scale of the theft. Julian was not just stealing my files. He was stealing my decade of late nights, my specialized education, and the countless hours I spent mastering the physics of live entertainment. He expected me to accept a paltry payout and disappear into the background, just like I did when I was 17 in that empty high school auditorium. But the variables had changed. When I was a teenager, I needed my parents to validate my existence. Now I was a self-sufficient adult standing between my family and financial ruin. If I refused to send Julian the final touring files, the stadium contract would disintegrate. The management team would cancel the vendor orders. The $200,000 second mortgage my parents took out would instantly default. Julian had built a financial hostage situation, assuming my sense of obligation would always override my sense of professional survival. He was wrong. I returned to my Oakland apartment. The space was dark, quiet, and familiar. I dropped my keys on the counter. I left the unsigned non-disclosure agreement inside my bag. I walked directly to my workstation and woke up my dual monitors. The digital rendering of the stadium stage glowed on the screens, a complex web of structural steel lighting arrays and hydraulic lifts. I made a calculated decision. It was the turning point of my entire professional life. I was done absorbing their cruelty. I was finished playing the compliant ghost. But I was not going to blow the whistle and destroy my parents' retirement in a sudden fit of rage. I was going to construct a trap so flawless, so deeply embedded in the foundation of the tour, that Julian would trigger it himself. In live event production, a stage design is not just a collection of pretty pictures. To make the lights move, the video walls sync, and the pyrotechnics fire on exact cues, the physical architecture must be translated into raw code. This code serves as the central nervous system of the entire show. Every fixture is assigned a specific digital address. Every motor is mapped to a command sequence. The master programming files are the most valuable assets on a tour. Without them, the stage is just a pile of dead metal. I spent the next 48 hours finalizing the master sequencing files. I optimized the routing paths. I locked in the weight calculations. I ensured every technical specification was exact, ready to be handed over to Serena Vale's physical touring crew. Then I initiated my quiet sabotage. I opened the core operating software. Deep within the root directory, far below the user interface where lighting directors select colors and movements, I accessed the foundational registry files. This is the bedrock of the code, a place only advanced system architects ever navigate. I created a new execution script. I embedded a complex, undeniable digital watermark directly into the staging infrastructure. I typed the command line carefully. The text was simple, but permanent. A Morgan Master Architecture. I did not just write the name once. I wove the signature into the primary data stream. Every time the control console powered up, every time the lighting rigs received a data packet, every time the video walls synced to the audio timecode, my name would run through the invisible digital veins of the system. It was a digital fingerprint that could not be deleted without corrupting the entire show file. Erasing the watermark would require a total rebuild of the staging code, a process that takes months and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Julian lacked the technical literacy to even locate the root directory, let alone untangle a coded watermark. He was a man who thought a color filter was a major engineering adjustment. He would never know it was there. He would hand these exact files to Serena Vale's elite technical team, proudly claiming them as his own proprietary property, while carrying my undeniable signature into the heart of their operation. I compiled the final data folders. I compressed them into a secure digital archive. I attached the archive to an email addressed to my brother. I typed a brief message stating that these were the master touring assets required for the production crew. I hit send. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The quiet humming of my computer tower was the only sound in the room. I felt a profound sense of clarity. For 15 years, my family had demanded that I remain small. They had rewritten our history to ensure Julianne always held the center stage. Now, Julianne was about to launch the highest-grossing pop tour of the decade, and he was doing it with a ticking bomb hidden inside his briefcase. I was no longer waiting for my parents to notice me. I had meticulously documented my own existence. The evidence was irrefutable, and it was currently sitting on the servers of one of the most powerful management firms in Los Angeles. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I watched the city lights flicker outside my window. Julian had his files. He had his contract. He had his manufactured genius. All I had to do now was wait for the inevitable moment when the sheer weight of a national stadium tour cracked his hollow facade wide open. The trap was set. But before the trap could spring, my parents decided to host a dinner to celebrate the son they believed had conquered the world. And they expected me to sit at the table and applaud. 2 months before Serena Vale's tour was scheduled to open, my parents decided to host a celebratory dinner. The invitation arrived via a text message from my mother on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after she had booked the reservation. I was an afterthought. The venue was an upscale steakhouse in San Francisco, the kind of establishment featuring mahogany-paneled walls, dim amber lighting, and leather booths that absorbed the sound of clinking silver. I knew the stark reality of my parents' finances. I knew a $200,000 lien rested heavily on their modest suburban home, a ticking debt waiting to detonate. Yet they were paying for a private dining room and ordering premium bottles of wine to maintain the illusion of Julian's prosperity. I wore a tailored black dress and drove across the bridge, fully aware I was walking into a theater production where I was cast solely to fill an empty seat in the audience. The private room smelled of roasted garlic and expensive red wine. Extended family members, close neighbors, and a few of Julian's superficial Los Angeles acquaintances occupied the long banquet table. Julian sat at the head, wearing a dark velvet blazer, pouring wine for his captive audience. He spoke loudly, his voice carrying an unearned authority. He described his grand vision for the opening night at Madison Square Garden. He talked about the floating LED halo descending from the ceiling. He detailed how the lighting arrays would cascade during the opening musical sequence. I sat near the foot of the table, separated by 3 heavy floral centerpieces, and listened to him use my precise engineering descriptions. He stripped away the complex math, the load-bearing variables, and the electrical distribution data, replacing my science with the vague, sweeping language of a misunderstood artist. He did not stumble over his words because he was not facing a seasoned production manager tonight. He was facing people who desperately wanted to believe the Morgan family had produced a prodigy. Halfway through the main course, Sylvia stood up. She tapped a silver spoon against her crystal wine glass. The low chatter in the room faded into an expectant quiet. My mother held her glass high, her eyes already glistening with curated tears. She looked down the length of the table at Julian with a profound, almost religious reverence. She spoke about the long, grueling hours he had put into his craft, conveniently ignoring the reality that his craft consisted entirely of forwarding my digital attachments. She praised his resilience and his unique creative spark. Then she delivered the line she had polished for this exact demographic. "Julian," she said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion, "you are the only one who truly made something of the Morgan name. You put us on the map." The guests murmured their warm agreement. Glasses clinked in unison. My father beamed from his seat next to her, clapping his hands together with a pride he had never once directed toward me. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I felt no sudden sting of betrayal. The domestic erasure was no longer an open wound. It was simply a confirmed diagnosis. I was the ghost in their machine, the invisible engine powering their vanity. As the dinner shifted toward the dessert service, a neighbor seated to my left leaned over. Mrs. Gable was a polite, retired woman who had lived next door to my parents for 2 decades. She offered a warm, somewhat patronizing smile, trying to include me in the glowing atmosphere. She asked how my little event hobbies were going up in Oakland. Before I could form a response, Sylvia interjected from across the table. Her hearing was remarkably sharp whenever a conversation threatened to pivot away from her golden son. "Oh, Adelaide is just behind a computer," my mother said. Her tone was light, airy, and devastatingly precise. She waved her hand through the air as if batting away a minor nuisance. "We don't brag about her. She is our quiet worker bee." Julian caught the end of the exchange. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, swirling the deep red wine in his glass. He smiled his signature hollow grin. He saw an opportunity to elevate his own status by using me as a stepping stone in front of his audience. "Leave Addie alone, Mom," he said, his voice projecting easily over the low chatter of the room. "She has a very stable job." "What do you make now, Addie?" $70,000 a year. It is good, honest work. Not everyone is built to handle the pressure of an 8-figure stadium deal. Some people are just meant to pull the cables and follow the blueprints. A few guests chuckled politely. Others offered sympathetic, tight-lipped nods in my direction. They expected me to flush with embarrassment. They expected me to lower my gaze, stare at my half-empty plate, and accept my designated role as the unremarkable, jealous sibling. I did not move. I sat perfectly still. I looked at my brother, taking in his velvet blazer, his least confidence, and his impending professional ruin. I looked at my mother, holding her expensive wine glass, desperate for the validation of her suburban peers. I looked at my father, a man who had mortgaged his remaining years on earth for a fabricated lie. The psychological trap that had held me for 15 years finally broke apart. I realized in that quiet, amber-lit room that even if Julian launched the tour successfully, even if he stood on a stage and publicly admitted he used my architectural designs, my parents would never give me the credit. They did not value the work itself. They valued the narrative. They chose Julian because he reflected the glamorous, effortless superiority they wanted for themselves. I was the gritty, technical reality they wished to hide. The erasure was permanent. Earning their respect was a mathematical impossibility, a faulty equation I had been trying to solve my entire life. You cannot win a game where the referee is actively burning the rule book. So I decided to stop playing. I did not shout. I did not throw my linen napkin on the table or deliver a dramatic, tearful speech about my stolen intellectual property. I operated with the clinical detachment of a production designer striking a stage. I quietly signaled the waiter standing near the doorway. I retrieved my wallet from my purse, pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills, and placed them directly on his silver tray to cover my portion of the extravagant meal. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my black dress. The conversation near my end of the table faltered. Sylvia frowned, her curated smile dropping. She asked where I was going right before the celebration cake was served. I looked at her. I did not offer a polite excuse about feeling ill or having an early morning meeting. I simply said I was leaving. I pushed my heavy leather chair in, turned my back on the private room, and walked out the door. I left them sitting in the dim lighting, surrounded by the hollow echoes of their own applause. The cool San Francisco air hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. I walked to my car, leaving the manufactured celebration behind. Julian thought he had won. He thought he had successfully relegated me to the background, secured his parental funding, and solidified his genius status in front of our family. But he forgot that a ghost architect builds the very stage everyone else has to stand on. Serena Vale's management team was hosting an exclusive industry gala in Hollywood the following week to officially launch the tour to the global press. Julian was required to attend. And because he was terrified of being cornered by real technical directors in a room full of veterans, he had already demanded I accompany him as his assistant. He was bringing me directly into the room with the very people who were unknowingly relying on my hidden code. The dinner was over. The real show was about to begin. A week after the steakhouse dinner, the Los Angeles night air felt thick with manufactured anticipation. The official launch gala for Serena Vale's stadium tour took place at a sprawling, multi-level rooftop venue in West Hollywood. Julian had mandated my presence. His text message 3 days prior was not a polite invitation. It was a panicked directive. He needed his technical shield. He was stepping into a room filled with seasoned production veterans, sound engineers, and staging directors. If any of them cornered him with a question about load capacities or data routing, he would drown. He required me to stand nearby, a human reference manual disguised as a quiet assistant. Earlier that afternoon, Sylvia had sent her customary pre-event warning. Her text read, "Remember to wear something subdued, Adelaide. Let your brother shine tonight. This is his industry introduction." I read the message, locked my phone screen, and ignored her directive entirely. For 15 years, I had draped myself in muted grays and shapeless black blazers, actively shrinking my physical presence to match the smallness my family assigned me. Not tonight. I wore a floor-length deep emerald gown. It was tailored sharp and commanded quiet attention. I walked into the rooftop venue looking like an equal, not an accessory. The space was a sensory overload of flashing camera bulbs, thumping bass lines, and waiters carrying silver trays of champagne. Music executives huddled in tight circles, exchanging leverage masked as casual conversation. Julian was instantly intoxicated by the proximity to fame. The moment we bypassed the velvet ropes, his fear of technical scrutiny was swallowed by his ego. He saw a cluster of high-profile influencers and minor celebrities near the main bar. He abandoned me within 60 seconds. He did not introduce me. He simply handed me his coat and walked away, eager to inject himself into photographs, he had not earned. Serena Vale was not an artist who tolerated mediocrity. She had spent a decade building her empire, from dive bars to arenas, notoriously firing producers who attempted to coast on past laurels. She demanded rigor. Her inner circle reflected that exact ethos. Marcus, her production manager, was the gatekeeper of that standard. I had no desire to mingle with Julian's superficial targets. I handed his coat to the cloakroom attendant and navigated through the dense crowd toward the perimeter of the venue. I found a quiet, glass-walled balcony overlooking the sprawling grid of Los Angeles streetlights. The distant hum of traffic provided a steady, grounding rhythm beneath the muffled thumping of the party inside. I leaned against the railing, enjoying the cool breeze. I felt a strange sense of finality. My watermark was already embedded in their servers. The trap was armed. I was just waiting for the timer to run out. I heard the heavy glass door slide open behind me. I expected a stray guest searching for a quiet corner. Instead, the heavy footsteps stopped a few feet away. I turned around. Marcus stood near the edge of the balcony. He was not wearing a tuxedo, opting instead for a sharp, tailored black suit that matched his pragmatic demeanor. Standing directly beside him was Serena Vale. Serena was striking, radiating the intense, focused energy of a woman who controlled her own orbit. She wore a structured crimson blazer, her eyes sharp and assessing. She did not carry a champagne flute. She was not here to celebrate. She was here to work. Marcus stepped forward. He bypassed all standard industry pleasantries. He did not ask how I was enjoying the party or offer a polite comment about the Los Angeles skyline. He operated with the blunt efficiency of a man managing an $18 million budget. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of printed paper. He handed it to me. I took the page. It was a direct printout of a core directory script from the staging software. Highlighting the center of the code block was my exact digital signature. "We ran a stress test on the rendering files this morning," Marcus said. His voice was low, carrying the gravelly texture of countless late-night arena loadouts. "We needed to adjust the descent rate on the hydraulic lift for the center halo. My lead programmer dug into the root directory to alter the timecode. We found this buried in the master execution script." He watched my face, looking for a reaction. I did not flinch. I handed the paper back to him. Marcus folded the sheet and slid it back into his pocket. He took a half step closer, his gaze locking onto mine with clinical intensity. "I sat in a boardroom with your brother 3 weeks ago," Marcus continued. "I asked him a basic question about dynamic weight loads. He panicked. The man does not know what a DMX universe is. He does not know how to calculate a voltage drop. He certainly does not know how to write an embedded digital watermark into a proprietary software architecture." Marcus paused, letting the silence stretch between us. The muffled music from the gala felt miles away. Then he asked the question that stripped away 15 years of Morgan family mythology. "You built this entire tour, didn't you?" The moment had arrived. The Golden Child's fragile narrative rested entirely in my hands. A lifetime of conditioning screamed at me to lower my eyes, to deflect the praise, to protect Julian's fragile ego and my parents' precarious financial state. But the woman standing in the emerald gown on that balcony was no longer the invisible teenager from the high school auditorium. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Serena Vale, who was watching me with an expression of intense, calculated silence. I did not cry. I did not boast or launch into a dramatic monologue about my brother's cruel entitlement. I maintained my calm, professional demeanor. I answered the question with the exact precision of an engineer verifying a blueprint. "Yes," I said, "the architecture, the CAD files, and the sequencing are entirely my original intellectual property." I kept my tone level, devoid of any emotional tremor. I drafted the initial structural wireframes in my Oakland apartment. I calculated the load limits. I mapped the decentralized power distribution. I built the code that syncs the lighting array to the audio timecode. Julian did not contribute a single mathematical equation to those files. He took my proof of concept, placed his agency logo over my work, and presented it as his own. Serena Vale took a slow breath. Her jaw tightened. She was a woman who despised industry frauds. She had clawed her way to the top by relying on genuine, unvarnished talent, and she recognized an imposter the moment the facade cracked. She looked at Marcus. Marcus gave her a brief, confirming nod. The veteran production manager had suspected the truth since the boardroom meeting. The watermark was simply the undeniable, documented proof he needed to act. Serena turned her attention back to me. She did not express pity. She expressed business. She asked me if I possessed the original, time-stamped source files to verify my claim. I told her I kept meticulous archives of every project I designed. I had the raw data, the independent LLC registration, and the initial email thread proving I sent the unformatted files to Julian with a strict, non-commercial disclaimer. I also mentioned the blank non-disclosure agreement Julian had shoved into my hands in a Century City parking garage, an agreement I refused to sign. Serena's eyes glinted with a sharp, formidable light. She hated parasites, and she had just discovered one attached to the largest tour of her career. She thanked me for my honesty. She told me to enjoy the rest of the evening, adding that her legal team would be in touch very shortly. Then she and Marcus turned and walked back into the crowded venue, disappearing into the sea of flashing lights and loud music. I stood alone on the balcony, the cool wind brushing against my face. I looked through the glass partition into the main room. Julian was holding a glass of expensive champagne, smiling wide for a photographer, networking with executives he had deceived. The truth had officially bypassed him. He was entirely unaware that his fabricated empire had just been dismantled behind a glass door. The timer had hit 0. The administration of his ruin was about to begin. The morning after the Hollywood Gala arrived with bright California sunshine. Julian woke up in his upscale apartment feeling invincible. His inbox contained a single brief email from Serena Vale's management group requesting his presence at their Beverly Hills headquarters for an urgent 9 o'clock meeting. Julian smiled at his phone screen. In his manufactured reality, an urgent morning meeting following a successful launch party meant only one thing. He assumed they wanted to finalize his upcoming press features, perhaps schedule a magazine cover shoot, or discuss expanding his creative director role for the European leg of the tour. He spent an hour curating his appearance. He selected a tailored navy suit, skipping the tie, to project the effortless aura of a young visionary. He drove his leased Porsche down the palm tree-lined avenues, rehearsing humble sound bites in the rearview mirror. He practiced thanking his team while ensuring all the credit funneled directly back to his own genius. He handed his keys to the valet and walked into the sleek marble lobby of the management tower. He was a man riding the crest of a fabricated wave, unaware that the ocean had already dried up. A silent receptionist escorted him to a corner conference room on the top floor. Julian pushed open the heavy glass door, a practiced grin already fixed on his face. He expected to find a table full of enthusiastic publicists holding mock-ups of tour posters. Instead, the room was chillingly sparse. Serena Vale sat at the center of the long mahogany table. She wore a sharp black blazer, her expression unreadable. To her left sat Marcus, the veteran production manager, his arms folded across his chest. To her right sat 2 men in dark gray suits holding identical leather portfolios. They were not publicists. They were corporate litigators. There was no coffee service. There was no small talk. Julian stopped in the doorway. His grin faltered, then slowly reassembled itself. He took a seat opposite Serena, offering a cheerful greeting. He asked if there was a sudden change in the marketing rollout. No one returned his smile. Marcus picked up a remote control and pointed it at the far wall. A high-definition projector hummed to life. The large screen did not display promotional photographs or ticketing strategies. It displayed a sprawling block of raw digital code. It was the master execution script for the staging software. Marcus leaned forward, resting his calloused hands on the table. He looked at Julian with the cold detachment of a surgeon examining a terminal chart. "We are reviewing the synchronization protocols for the opening sequence," Marcus said. His voice was flat, devoid of any conversational warmth. I need you to explain the data routing logic for the kinetic winches. Walk me through how you balance the load distribution on the primary truss." Julian let out a short, nervous laugh. He adjusted his tailored jacket. He leaned back in his leather chair, attempting to adopt his usual posture of high-level delegation. He said he preferred to leave the granular coding to his technical staff so he could focus on the overarching emotional journey of the audience. Marcus did not blink. He ignored the pivot entirely. He asked a more precise question. He told Julian to calculate the sheer force exerted on the secondary support beams when the LED halo descends at 3 meters per second. A visible bead of sweat formed at Julian's temple. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the two silent lawyers. He opened his mouth and began stringing together empty industry phrases. He talked about immersive synergy, dynamic visual paradigms, and pushing the boundaries of the traditional concert experience. He sounded exactly like a man reading a brochure in a foreign language he did not understand. "Stop talking," Serena said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a sharp, authoritative edge that cut through his desperate rambling. Marcus pressed a button on the remote. The code on the projection screen scrolled rapidly downward, stopping deep within the foundational registry files. A single line of text was highlighted in bright yellow: "A Morgan Master Architecture." Julian stared at the screen. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His fabricated empire fractured into 1,000 pieces in a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat seized. He finally managed a weak, trembling whisper, claiming there must be a misunderstanding. He stammered that his sister was just a low-level assistant who helped with some basic data entry and must have inserted her name by mistake. The lead attorney opened his leather portfolio. The sound of the thick paper turning echoed in the silent room. "There is no misunderstanding," the attorney said. His tone was surgical and devoid of pity. "You signed a binding contract representing that your agency was the sole creator and legal owner of all intellectual property tied to this stage design. We have verified that the architecture, the blueprints, and the proprietary software routing were authored entirely by Adelaide Morgan. You committed intellectual property fraud." Julian gripped the edge of the mahogany table. He begged them to listen, promising he could bring his sister in to sign a retroactive waiver. He swore they were a family business and that the paperwork was just a minor administrative oversight. The second attorney spoke up, outlining the administrative ruin that was already in motion. He stated that claiming uncredited intellectual property constitutes a material breach of contract. As of 8 o'clock this morning, all payments to the Morgan Boutique Agency have been halted. The initial vendor deposits have been frozen. The agency is officially under legal review. The words struck Julian like physical blows. The vendor deposits were frozen. Those were the exact funds required to secure the staging equipment. Without those deposits, the entire production schedule would collapse. But the implications ran much deeper, striking at the very foundation of his personal life. If the management firm terminated the contract, the $200,000 loan his parents took out would instantly default. The bank would seize their suburban home. Julian realized he had not just ruined his own career, he had bankrupted his mother and father. Serena Vale leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the polished wood. She looked at Julian with profound disgust. She told him she built her career by outworking her competitors, not by stealing from the people in her own shadow. She refused to employ a fraud. However, Serena continued, canceling this tour would punish hundreds of innocent crew members. The stage architecture is brilliant. The person who designed it deserves to execute it. So I am offering you a single exit strategy. Julian looked up, his eyes wide with desperate hope. He nodded rapidly, promising to do whatever they asked. You have exactly 48 hours, Serena said, her voice uncompromising. You will legally transfer the creative directorship, all associated production contracts, and all outstanding financial payments directly to Adelaide Morgan. Your agency will relinquish every claim to this project. You will sign a full admission of fault regarding the intellectual property. Julian swallowed hard, his hands shaking. He asked what would happen if he refused. The lead attorney closed his portfolio. He stated that if Julian did not comply within 48 hours, they would cancel the tour. They would file a ruinous lawsuit against his agency for fraud and breach of contract. They would ensure every major production house in Los Angeles knew exactly why he was fired. And they would let his creditors dismantle his parents' estate piece by piece. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an execution. Julian stood up. His legs felt hollow. The tailored navy suit suddenly looked like a costume he had outgrown. He did not offer a closing argument. He did not attempt to salvage his dignity. He turned and walked out of the glass conference room, leaving his shattered ego and the mahogany table. He rode the elevator down to the lobby in a state of sheer panic. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The reality of his situation closed in around him. He had spent his entire life taking the credit while his sister did the work. He had mocked her salary, dismissed her talent, and used her expertise to build a paper castle. Now the wind had arrived. To save himself and to save his parents from total financial ruin, he had to drive straight to Oakland. He had to beg for mercy from the one woman he had spent 30 years trying to erase. The pounding on my front door began shortly before noon. It was not a polite knock. It was a rapid, desperate hammering that rattled the brass hinges. I set my coffee mug on the kitchen island and walked across the hardwood floor. When I opened the door, Julian pushed his way inside without an invitation. The polished Los Angeles visionary had vanished. His tailored navy suit was wrinkled, his collar was unbuttoned, and his silk pocket square hung loosely from his jacket. A thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead, and his breathing was erratic. He looked like a man who had just outrun a burning building, only to realize he was still on fire. He did not offer a greeting. He threw a crushed leather portfolio onto my quartz countertop. He paced the length of my small living room, dragging a hand through his carefully styled hair. He turned to face me, his chest heaving, his face flushed a deep, panicked red. "You planned this," he said. His voice was shrill, cracking under the strain of his own terror. "You set me up. You knew exactly what you were doing when you put that watermark in the code. You wanted them to find it." I walked back to my kitchen island. I pulled out a metal stool, sat down, and picked up my ceramic mug. I took a slow sip of the dark roast coffee. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic energy. I told him I simply signed my own architectural design. I stated that securing a digital patent is standard procedure for any ghost architect handing over foundational assets. Julian slammed his hands onto the countertop. The sudden noise echoed in the quiet apartment, but I did not flinch. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and wild. He detailed the ultimatum Serena Vale delivered in the Beverly Hills conference room. He explained that his payments were halted. He confessed that the management firm was threatening a ruinous lawsuit if he did not legally transfer the creative directorship and all financial compensation directly to me within 48 hours. He unzipped the crushed portfolio and pulled out a stack of hastily drafted legal documents. He pushed them across the court surface toward my coffee mug. "You have to sign a retroactive intellectual property waiver right now," he demanded. "You have to email their attorneys and tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them I was always the lead designer and you were just a hired technician. Tell them the watermark was a filing error." I looked at the documents. I looked back at my brother. I asked him why I would ever commit perjury to protect a man who stole my work and offered me a $5,000 hush payment in a parking garage. "Because Mom and Dad will lose the house, Adelaide," he yelled. His voice broke on my name. He weaponized their precarious financial state, twisting the knife he had planted himself. "If this tour gets canceled, the vendor deposits vanish. The bank will foreclose on the second mortgage. They will be out on the street. You cannot do this to them. You owe us this. You owe us this." The audacity of the statement hung in the air. He had drained their retirement, leveraged their home, and stolen my career. Yet he framed himself as the victim of my boundaries. Before I could dissect his hollow logic, my cell phone illuminated on the counter. The caller identification displayed Sylvia. Julian pointed at the glowing screen. "Answer it," he ordered. "Tell her what you are doing to this family." I tapped the green icon and placed the call on speakerphone, setting the device down next to the unsigned waiver. I did not say hello. I just let the silence stretch over the cellular connection. "Adelaide," my mother said. Her voice was already thick with tears. It was a familiar, rehearsed sound. I had heard that exact cadence whenever I tried to assert a boundary during my childhood. It was the sound of conditional love being withdrawn to ensure compliance. Julian called me from the road. He told me what happened. He told me about the mistake you made with the software files. She called it a mistake. She framed my undeniable proof of authorship as a technical glitch that was currently inconveniencing her golden son. "Please do not be so selfish," Sylvia sobbed. The weeping escalated, designed to trigger my ingrained sense of guilt. "Julian has worked so hard to cultivate these connections. He is on the verge of changing all our lives. If you take this away from him, you are taking everything away from your father and me. We will lose the roof over our heads. Just sign the paper he gave you. Let your brother have his moment. We will pay you back eventually. I promise we will make it right." I sat perfectly still on my metal stool. I listened to the sharp intake of her breath through the speaker. I watched Julian standing across the counter, nodding along with her words, waiting for me to break. In that precise moment, a profound realization settled over me, cold and clear. They were not angry at Julian for committing intellectual property fraud. They were not angry that he lied to global executives or that he risked their home on a gamble he lacked the skills to win. They were angry at me for existing as the truth. They were furious that my undeniable competence had punctured their curated mythology. They expected me to sacrifice my name, my reputation, and my rightful compensation to sustain a lie that excluded me. My gaze drifted away from Julian's desperate face. I looked past the kitchen island toward the wooden bookshelf in my living room. Resting on the middle shelf was a simple silver frame. It held a photograph of me at 22 years old, wearing a black graduation gown, holding a university diploma. I stared at the girl in the picture. I remembered that day with vivid clarity. I paid for my own tuition by working late shifts at a campus theater. When the commencement ceremony arrived, the auditorium was packed with cheering families holding bouquets of flowers and colorful balloons. I walked across the stage to polite, scattered applause from strangers. When the event concluded, I stood on the campus lawn alone. My parents had cited a scheduling conflict. Julian had a minor club gig in a neighboring town, and they needed to help him load his rented speakers. I took that graduation photograph by balancing my phone against a brick wall and setting a timer. They never showed up for my real achievements. They never celebrated the long hours, the grueling technical exams, or the quiet dedication that built my career. Yet when Julian's fabricated empire began to crumble, they demanded I surrender my entire identity to rebuild his paper walls. I looked at the silver frame, and the final thread of my childhood obligation simply dissolved. Saving them meant erasing myself forever. It meant validating their belief that my only purpose was to serve as a stepping stone for my brother. It meant accepting that I would always be the ghost, and he would always be the visionary. I reached out and picked up my phone. Sylvia was still speaking, her voice pitching higher as she layered another guilt trip over the previous one. She told me a good daughter would never put her parents through this kind of stress. I did not argue with her. I did not explain the complex routing systems or the legal realities of a breached stadium contract. I did not tell her that Julian was the one who signed the fraudulent paperwork. Debating a delusion only gives it oxygen. I ended the call. I tapped the red button mid-sentence, cutting off the rehearsed tears and the manipulative pleas. The sudden silence flooded the kitchen, heavy and final. Julian flinched. He stared at the dark screen of my phone, unable to comprehend what had just happened. For his entire life, a phone call from a crying Sylvia was the ultimate trump card. It was the mechanism that forced everyone back into their designated roles. The mechanism had just failed. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled onto dry land. The terror in his eyes was raw and unpolished. He realized he was standing in a room where his charm held no currency, where his mother's tears held no weight, and where his false authority had been stripped down to the studs. I pushed my coffee mug aside. I picked up the stack of retroactive intellectual property waivers he had thrown onto the court's counter. I looked Julian dead in the eye, holding his frantic gaze with a cool, unshakable certainty. I was preparing to deliver a verdict that would reshape the rest of our lives. The stage was set for my ultimate boundary, and this time, I was writing the script. I held the stack of retroactive intellectual property waivers in my hand. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of my brother's panic and my mother's tears. Julian watched my fingers, his breath catching in his throat. He expected me to locate a pen. He expected 15 years of ingrained compliance to override my survival instinct. I walked past him. I stopped beside the stainless steel trash receptacle near my kitchen sink. I opened my hand and let the unread legal documents fall into the bin. "No," I said. The word was a single syllable, but it carried the finality of a closing steel door. Julian stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the edge of my refrigerator. He blinked rapidly, his mind failing to process the rejection. He opened his mouth, sputtering about the mortgage, the bank, the impending ruin. I raised my hand, a subtle gesture that demanded silence. I spoke with the clinical precision of a surgeon excising necrotic tissue. "I am not responsible for the debt you acquired through fraud," I told him. My tone remained level, devoid of the emotional static he relied upon. "I am not responsible for the fact that our parents decided to gamble their retirement on a business you do not know how to run. Their reckless favoritism is their own burden. I will no longer serve as the collateral damage for this family's delusions." I turned my back on his pale, sweating face and walked toward the small filing cabinet tucked beneath my workstation. I opened the bottom drawer. I retrieved a simple blue folder. It was thick, holding physical copies of the digital records I had meticulously archived over the past 72 hours. I started keeping physical files 5 years ago after a prominent event producer tried to claim credit for a festival layout I engineered. I learned early that verbal agreements dissolve in the face of prestige, but documented timestamps are bulletproof. I never needed to use those folders against my own blood, but the habit remained. I walked back to the kitchen island and dropped the blue folder onto the quartz surface. It landed with a satisfying, authoritative thud. I opened the cover. Julian pushed himself away from the refrigerator and edged closer, his eyes scanning the documents. The first page was an official certificate from the California Secretary of State. It displayed my newly registered limited liability company, Morgan Architecture. The ink was fresh. The second page was a printed email thread from Serena Vale's lead corporate attorney, time-stamped at 7 o'clock that morning. The third document was a direct employment contract. I tapped the pristine white paper. "Serena Vale's legal team contacted me hours before you arrived," I explained. "They bypassed your agency entirely. They reviewed my master code, verified my ownership, and drafted a direct agreement. I am officially taking over the stadium tour as the sole credited creative director and lead production architect. I report directly to Marcus." Julian stared at the contract. His name was nowhere on the page. His agency logo was absent. The reality of his situation crystallized in his mind. He was being excised from the highest grossing project of his life. "You cannot do this," he whispered. His voice lacked any trace of his former swagger. "My agency will collapse." "Your agency never existed," I replied. "It was a hollow shell built around my brain. And I am walking away. You are removed from the project, effective immediately." He slumped against the island, burying his face in his hands. He muttered about our parents, about the bank seizing the suburban house where we grew up. He tried to pivot back to guilt, the only currency he had left. I anticipated the pivot. I reached into the blue folder and pulled out a fourth document. It was a single sheet of paper, drafted by a neutral legal mediator I had consulted online the previous night. I slid the paper across the counter. I told them I was offering one singular concession. Julian lowered his hands. He read the header. It was a formal confession of intellectual property theft and a relinquishment of all corporate claims. I will advance you a buyout, I said, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. The sum is $200,000. It is the exact amount required to pay off the second mortgage our parents took out. It will clear the debt at the bank. It severs the financial hostage situation you created. You will wire the money directly to the lender. You will not keep a single cent for yourself. He stared at the numbers printed on the page. It was a lifeline, but it was coated in poison. In exchange for the funds, I continued outlining the cold mechanics of his surrender. You will sign this document. You will admit in writing that you stole my architectural blueprints. You will confess that you presented my proprietary rendering files as your own creation. You will formally dissolve your claim to the Serena Vale tour. If I sign this, he said, his voice trembling, my career in Los Angeles is over. No management firm will ever hire me if this gets out. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the quartz surface. If you do not sign it, Serena Vale's lawyers will file their lawsuit by tomorrow morning. Your career will end anyway, but you will also face criminal fraud charges, and Mom and Dad will lose their home. The choice was binary. It was the same mechanism of control he had tried to use on me, inverted and backed by undeniable legal weight. I was not destroying him. I was simply forcing him to survive the environment he built. Julian looked around my modest apartment, searching for an escape hatch that did not exist. He looked at the trash can holding his useless waivers. He looked at the framed college diploma on my bookshelf, the silent testament to the years I spent working while he took the applause. He reached into the inner pocket of his wrinkled navy blazer and pulled out a silver pen. His hand shook as he uncapped it. He hovered over the signature line for 10 agonizing seconds. He wanted to argue. He wanted to scream. He wanted Sylvia to call back and save him. No one called. The silence held firm. Julian pressed the pen to the paper. He traced his name on the dotted line, his signature jagged and uneven. He dated the document. He pushed the paper back across the counter. He did not look at me. He capped his pen, picked up his empty leather portfolio, and walked toward my front door. He moved with the slow, heavy gait of a man who had just aged a decade in 20 minutes. He opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and let the latch click shut behind him. I picked up the signed confession. The ink was dark and permanent. I slid the paper into my blue folder and closed the cover. The golden child was administratively ruined. He was walking back to a repossessed car, a dissolved agency, and a fake narrative that could no longer protect him. The financial chain tying me to my family's dysfunction was severed. I had purchased my freedom, and I had secured the credit for my own genius. I stood alone in my kitchen, breathing in the quiet air. I felt a profound sense of lightness, the kind of weightlessness that only comes when you stop carrying someone else's gravity. The tour was mine. The architecture was mine. But as I packed my bags to move to the Los Angeles rehearsal venue the following week, I knew the emotional fallout was far from over. My parents were about to discover that their visionary son was a fraud, and their invisible daughter was running the show. The transition from the shadows to the spotlight required me to face the very people who put me in the dark. 3 weeks later, the theoretical geometry of my computer screens transformed into a physical reality inside a sprawling warehouse arena in Burbank. The air tasted of ozone, hot metal, and theatrical fog. 200 highly specialized technicians moved across the concrete floor. Riggers hung suspended from the steel rafters, securing heavy chain hoists. Programmers sat at long folding tables, their faces illuminated by the glow of complex lighting consoles. Audio engineers tuned the line arrays, sending low-frequency test tones that vibrated deep within my chest. I stood at the center of the command station, wearing a simple black communication headset. I was no longer a hidden ghost. I was the architect in full daylight. I directed the chaos with clinical precision. A LED lighting technician approached my desk asking for a routing clarification on the automated spotlights flanking the central halo. I did not hesitate or search for empty industry phrases. I instructed him to switch the data patch from Universe 4 to Universe 7, bypassing a faulty relay node I had identified during the morning system check. He nodded, jotting down the numerical sequence on his clipboard, and walked away to execute the command. There was no questioning my authority. Competence is a universal language on a production floor. Marcus stood a few feet away, holding a manifest containing the daily rehearsal schedule. The veteran manager watched the exchange. He did not offer patronizing praise. He treated me with the blunt, earned respect reserved for industry equals. Serena Vale sat in the front row of the empty stadium seats, observing the heavy machinery moving in perfect synchronization. Whenever a structural issue arose, neither of them looked around for a charismatic visionary to charm away the problem. They looked directly at me. The workflow was efficient, devoid of the frantic, stressful energy that usually surrounds an unqualified leader. Julian's absence did not create a void. It removed a dangerous bottleneck. I climbed the metal stairs to the primary staging platform to inspect the hydraulic lifts. The steel grates felt solid beneath my boots. For a decade, I had handed my blueprints over to other people, watching from the periphery as they took the bows for my late nights and complex math. Now standing on the very structure I birthed from a blank digital canvas, the disparity between my professional reality and my family's ongoing denial became starkly clear. In this building, my intellect governed millions of dollars in equipment. I ensured the safety of a global pop star and her entire crew. My calculations dictated the placement of every cable, every laser, and every pyrotechnic charge. Yet outside these concrete walls, I remained tied to a domestic narrative that stubbornly refused to acknowledge my altitude. My cell phone vibrated in the side pocket of my cargo pants. I pulled the device out, expecting an update from the catering vendor or a logistics email regarding the upcoming fleet of transport trucks. The screen illuminated with a text message notification. The sender was Richard. My father had not called or texted since the day Julian returned to their suburban home, defeated and exposed. The bank received my wire transfer. The $200,000 mortgage was cleared. I saved their financial standing, honoring my end of the brutal bargain. I anticipated total silence, the usual coping mechanism my family employed when confronted with an uncomfortable truth. Instead, Richard chose to reach out on the eve of my greatest professional triumph. I opened the message. It contained 3 brief sentences. Your mother is very depressed. Julian is staying in his childhood bedroom. I hope you are happy. I stood on the edge of the sprawling stage. The LED panels beneath my feet pulsed with a vibrant blue test pattern. I read the text a second time, analyzing the syntax the way I would debug a faulty string of code. There was no inquiry about my well-being. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that I was currently running the most anticipated music event of the year. There was zero gratitude for the buyout that rescued his retirement fund from foreclosure. Richard bypassed the reality of my ascension entirely. He framed my success solely through the lens of Julian's failure. In my father's eyes, I had not achieved a monumental career milestone. I had merely committed an act of sabotage against the true star of the Morgan household. A year ago, a message like that would have triggered a deep, suffocating guilt. I would have drafted a dozen different replies trying to justify my actions, pleading for his understanding, desperate to prove that I deserved a fraction of the pride he lavished on my brother. I would have apologized for surviving. But the air in the rehearsal arena was clear, and so was my mind. The lingering emotional hold they possessed finally snapped cleanly and permanently. I realized my parents would never love the real me. They lacked the capacity to appreciate a daughter who spoke in facts, who built quiet foundations, and who demanded accountability. They only loved the version of Julian they invented. They worshipped a mirror that reflected their own unearned arrogance back at them. When I shattered that mirror, I did not just expose my brother, I exposed them. They preferred the comfortable lie over the inconvenient truth. Forgiving them meant accepting a permanent demotion in my own life. It meant returning to the cardboard shoebox hidden under the bed. I did not type a response. I did not feel the urge to explain the physics of the situation to a man who refused to open his eyes. Explanations are a privilege reserved for people willing to understand. I pressed the options menu on the text thread. I selected delete. The conversation vanished, erasing a decade of passive-aggressive control in a single digital stroke. I blocked his number, finalizing the administrative boundary I established in my kitchen 3 weeks prior. I slid the phone back into my pocket. The weight of their disappointment no longer anchored me. Let Julian sleep in his childhood bedroom. Let Sylvia mourn the loss of her cocktail party bragging rights. Their grief was a self-inflicted wound, and I was no longer offering my career as a bandage. I pressed the button on my communication headset, opening the main channel to the entire production crew. The low chatter on the frequency ceased instantly, replaced by the crackling anticipation of 200 professionals waiting for their architect. I called for the final sequence run-through. I instructed the lighting director to plunge the arena into total darkness. I verified the safety clearances with the rigging department. "Stand by on the grid," I said, my voice steady and echoing slightly through the empty stadium seating. "Execute timecode on my mark." I counted down from 3. I called the cue for the pyrotechnics. A brilliant wall of sparks erupted from the downstage edge, illuminating the vast warehouse in a stark golden flash. The heat washed over my face, fierce and undeniable. The hydraulic lifts engaged, raising the central platform with a smooth, terrifying power. The audio system kicked in, pushing a wave of sound that shook the concrete pillars. I watched the machinery execute my exact mathematical commands. The design was flawless. The foundation was secure. I stood in the center of the blinding light, feeling the heavy vibration resonating through the soles of my boots. There was no ghost left inside me. The California rehearsals were officially complete. I turned off my personal cell phone. I packed my blueprints into a hard-shell travel case. We were ready for New York. The East Coast was waiting, and I was about to introduce my real name to 50,000 strangers. While my flight descended into the concrete grid of New York, a different kind of landing was taking place in Los Angeles. Julian attempted to pivot. He assumed the Serena Vale disaster was a temporary setback. He believed his charm still carried currency. He secured an interview at a mid-tier production agency in West Hollywood. A year prior, he would have considered this firm beneath him. Now, it was his only lifeline. He walked into the glass-paneled office wearing the same navy suit from the Beverly Hills disaster. He sat across the desk from a pragmatic operations director named Thomas. Julian leaned back, flashing his practiced grin. He began his standard monologue about immersive synergy and dynamic visual paradigms. He claimed he parted ways with the stadium tour over creative differences. Thomas did not nod along. Live entertainment is a remarkably small ecosystem. The people who write the checks all talk to each other. Information travels faster than light across a lighting console. Thomas looked at Julian over the rim of his glasses. He opened a slim manila folder on his desk. "Creative differences," Thomas repeated. The tone was dry. That is a fascinating way to describe a signed admission of intellectual property theft. Julian froze. His grin cracked. He tried to backtrack, stammering a rehearsed excuse about a minor contractual misunderstanding. Thomas closed the folder. He informed Julian that Marcus had circulated a private advisory memo to every major production house on the West Coast. The memo was brief. It advised against employing the Morgan Boutique Agency due to a severe breach of professional ethics. Thomas stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. He told my brother that charm does not build stages. Julian was not escorted out by security. He was not yelled at. He was simply dismissed. He walked out of the building carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of his own ruined reputation. The financial fallout arrived with equal precision. The buyout money I wired to the bank satisfied the second mortgage, sparing our parents from immediate foreclosure. It did not cover Julian's extravagant Los Angeles lifestyle. He had leased a luxury Porsche SUV under the assumption that a 7-figure creative director fee would soon arrive. Without my invisible labor, he had zero income. 3 days after his failed interview, Julian woke up in his upscale apartment. He looked out the window and saw a flatbed tow truck idling near the curb. A repossession agent was securing heavy steel chains to the front axle of his car. Julian did not run outside to argue. He knew the bank held the paperwork. The vehicle was towed away, leaving an empty space on the pavement. To avoid eviction, Julian was forced to abandon his visionary persona. He took a job. It was not a creative position. He secured a role as an entry-level logistics coordinator for a regional trade show supplier. He traded his velvet blazers for a standard-issued polo shirt. His new reality consisted of sitting in a windowless cubicle, answering phone calls, and tracking the shipment of folding tables. There were no VIP lanyards. There were no magazine features. His new supervisor was a stern woman who cared only about shipping deadlines. When Julian attempted to offer a creative suggestion regarding the layout of the storage warehouse, she told him to focus on inputting the tracking numbers. He was reprimanded for arriving late. He was written up for taking an unauthorized break. The man who once demanded I hand over my intellectual property was now asking permission to use the restroom. The contrast was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He sat under fluorescent lights staring at rows of uniform data, living the exact life he had mocked me for enduring. Meanwhile, the domestic mythology fractured in my suburban hometown. Sylvia had spent 30 years cultivating a pristine narrative. She relied on her weekly social gatherings to broadcast her superiority. 2 weeks before the Madison Square Garden opening, she attended a neighborhood luncheon hosted by Mrs. Gable. The dining room was filled with women sipping iced tea and discussing local events. Sylvia waited for the inevitable opening to bring up the stadium tour. She planned to vague away Julian's departure, perhaps claiming the pop star was too difficult to work with. She never got the chance. Mrs. Gable placed a crystal pitcher on the table and pulled out her smartphone. She mentioned she had been reading an industry article about the upcoming Serena Vale production. She scrolled through the text, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. She looked across the table at my mother. "Sylvia, Mrs. Gable," said her voice carrying clearly over the gentle clatter of silverware. The article highlights the lead production architect. It says Adelaide Morgan is directing the entire visual concept. I thought you said Julian was running the show. His name is nowhere in this press release. The room fell silent. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward my mother. Sylvia stiffened. The color drained from her cheeks. She attempted a weak laugh, a frantic sound that fooled no one. She tried to formulate a lie. She opened her mouth to say there must be a typo or that Julian was working behind the scenes on a separate leg of the tour. But the documented facts were sitting on a glowing screen right in front of her peers. Mrs. Gable pressed the issue, pointing out a direct quote from Serena Vale praising the brilliant female engineer who built the stage from scratch. The polished armor cracked. Sylvia could not spin the undeniable truth. She picked up her designer purse, offered a flimsy excuse about a sudden headache, and retreated. She walked out the front door of her neighbor's house, leaving her shattered prestige on the dining table. Following that luncheon, Sylvia stopped attending the weekly country club gatherings. She could no longer walk down the aisles of the local grocery store without fearing an inquisitive question from a passing acquaintance. She removed the framed photograph of Julian shaking hands with the Los Angeles promoter from the fireplace mantel. The empty space on the wood surface served as a daily reminder of her misplaced faith. The house grew silent. There were no more celebratory toasts. There were no more breathless phone calls detailing a fake success. The Morgan family group chat went permanently dormant. Richard retreated further into his armchair watching television and avoiding conversations with the neighbors. Their downfall was not a fiery cinematic explosion. No one screamed. No one threw any glass trophies. The consequences were cold, administrative, and absolute. They were simply stripped of the illusion they had guarded so fiercely. They were forced to live in the unremarkable, unglamorous reality they had spent 3 decades trying to avoid. They had traded my loyalty for a paper castle, and now they were left standing in the rain. They had to wake up every day knowing their golden son was sitting in a cubicle tracking inventory, while the daughter they dismissed was commanding a global stage. The trap I built did not destroy them. It just introduced them to gravity. I did not feel joy knowing they were suffering. I felt a profound, settling peace. The energy I used to spend seeking their validation was now redirected entirely into my own ambition. The East Coast air was crisp as my taxi navigated the dense traffic of Manhattan. The sprawling skyline loomed ahead, a jagged edge of steel and glass. I checked my digital itinerary. The load-in process at Madison Square Garden was scheduled to begin in 2 hours. The convoy of transport trucks was already idling near the loading dock. My taxi pulled to a halt near the iconic circular facade of the arena. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the bustling New York pavement. The sheer scale of the venue was intimidating. It was a legendary space, a proving ground for the greatest entertainers in history. I looked up at the towering exterior walls. I was not arriving as a guest. I was arriving as the architect. I pulled my hard-shell case from the trunk and walked toward the staff entrance. The stage was waiting. The air inside Madison Square Garden crackled with a distinct electrical anticipation. It was opening night. 50,000 ticket holders funneled through the turnstiles, generating a collective hum that vibrated through the dense concrete floors. The scent of the arena was a unique mixture of spilled beer, hot circuitry, and theatrical fog. I stood at the front-of-house control center, a fortified technical island positioned precisely in the center of the stadium seating. My hands rested on the cool metal of the primary lighting console, a standard black communication headset pressed over my ears, feeding me the crisp, steady chatter of my production crew. When the house lights dropped, the initial roar of the audience struck me like a physical wave. I engaged the opening cue. The central LED halo I had engineered in my quiet Oakland apartment descended from the steel rafters, glowing with a fierce, brilliant gold. It stopped exactly 3 inches above the main performance platform, a testament to relentless mathematical precision. The crowd erupted a sonic boom of sheer joy. Serena Vale emerged from beneath the stage on a hydraulic lift I had personally calibrated. The show commenced, and it functioned with flawless execution. Every laser burst, every synchronized video transition, and every pyrotechnic cue fired without a single hesitation. For 2 continuous hours, I commanded the visual heartbeat of a legendary venue. I watched my structural geometry translate into pure art. The motorized trusses shifted seamlessly, altering the shape of the performance space to match the varying tempo of the music. As the dynamic lighting arrays painted the crowd in sweeping colors, my thoughts briefly drifted back to the cardboard shoebox sitting beneath my childhood bed. I remembered the hollow silence of that high school auditorium 15 years prior. I recalled the empty chairs where my parents promised they would sit. They had scolded me for expecting their presence. They demanded I accept the background. Tonight, standing at the helm of the highest-grossing tour of the year, I realized I no longer craved their attendance. I had built a universe that required no false validation. My brother Julian had tried to steal this exact vantage point, assuming he could wear my brilliance like a borrowed jacket. He failed because a stolen blueprint cannot teach you how to fly. A visionary relies on charm, but an architect relies on gravity. Gravity always wins. The final act reached its crescendo. The main set ended with a deafening sequence of coordinated spark fountains, a visual spectacle that required intricate timing and rigorous safety protocols. The stadium plunged into total darkness, signaling the traditional pause before the encore. The audience stomped their feet, shaking the foundational pillars of the ancient building. The rhythmic thud echoed in my ears. I prepared to trigger the closing lighting sequence. I hovered my fingers over the motorized faders, waiting for Marcus to call the standby command over the secured headset frequency. Marcus did not call the cue. Instead, the main public address system hummed to life. A single, isolated spotlight snapped on, illuminating Serena Vale standing alone on the downstage edge. She held a silver microphone. She was breathing heavily, sweat shining on her forehead. The crowd shrieked, assuming she was about to launch into her biggest chart-topping hit. Serena raised her left hand. A hush rippled across the vast space spreading outward until 50,000 people stood in sudden, profound silence. The rapid transition from deafening noise to pin-drop quiet felt surreal. Serena spoke. Her voice resonated through the hanging line arrays echoing off the highest tiers of the arena. She talked about the deep illusions embedded within the music industry. She explained that fans always see the singer, the backup dancers, and the flashing lights, but they rarely notice the foundation holding everyone up. She stated that the entertainment business is notorious for hiding its builders. The industry thrives on keeping the technical geniuses locked in dark rooms, while the charismatic salesmen take the bows. She spoke about the persistent tendency of loud, empty men to steal the credit from the quiet women who actually draft the blueprints. I stood frozen at the control board. My hands remained suspended above the console. This interruption was not in the official script. I had authored every single second of this production, mapping out the time code down to the millisecond, yet I had no idea what was happening. I glanced sideways at Marcus. The veteran production manager offered a very small, knowing smile. He had planned this deviation. He had coordinated with the artists and the riggers to bypass my control board. Serena looked out into the dark expanse of the arena, scanning the venue until her gaze locked onto the front of house barricade. "Tonight," Serena said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce timbre, "this entire world you are standing inside was built by one extraordinary woman. It is time you knew her name." Serena signaled the upper catwalks. A high-intensity follow spot, operated manually by a rigger I had trained, ignited high above the floor. The beam of pure white light cut a sharp, steep angle through the theatrical haze and struck me directly. I was instantly bathed in a blinding, undeniable glow. The giant jumbotron screens flanking the main stage flickered. The live camera feeds switched destinations. My face, wearing the black communication headset, staring wide-eyed into the sudden glare, was projected 50 feet high for the entire stadium to see. I could see my own reflection on the towering screens, a ghost suddenly pulled into the sharp focus of reality. For a fraction of a second, the arena held its breath. Then the eruption happened. 50,000 strangers rose to their feet. The sound was not a polite, restrained golf course clap. It was a roaring thunder, a tidal wave of genuine appreciation that crashed over the metal barricades and hit me squarely in the chest. People pointed at the control island, cheering, whistling, and raising their hands. They were clapping for the math. They were clapping for the late nights, the precise load-bearing calculations, the embedded digital watermarks, and the sheer, unyielding competence I had brought into existence. The noise was an overwhelming physical force. I reached up and pulled the headset off my ears. I let it rest around my neck. I needed to hear the sound without any electronic filter. The applause vibrated deeply in my ribcage, a tactile sensation validating my existence. My eyes welled with sudden tears, reflecting the stark white beam of the follow spot. I did not try to blink them away or hide my face from the roaming broadcast cameras. For my entire life, my family had trained me to shrink. They taught me to apologize for taking up space. They ordered me to step aside so my brother could harvest the praise, convincing me that seeking recognition was a character flaw. They conditioned me to believe that my worth was invisible, that my labor only held value if it remained uncredited and silent. They were wrong. Standing in the blinding center of Madison Square Garden, surrounded by a roaring ocean of humanity, I experienced pure, undeniable catharsis. The psychological chains snapped. The ghost architect was dead. I had forged my own stage, and it was infinitely grander than the fragile least illusion Julian tried to construct. I smiled, looking up at the glowing jumbotrons, claiming my rightful place in the light. I let the overwhelming roar wash away the last lingering remnants of my childhood insecurity. The standing ovation continued, a sustained outpouring of respect that stretched into a full minute. The opening night was a monumental triumph, but the evening was not quite finished. As the applause finally began to transition back into the rhythmic chanting for the encore, my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the console desk. The morning after the opening show, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan. The city below was a sprawling grid of yellow taxis and hurried pedestrians, moving to a rhythm that felt distant and muted through the thick, soundproof glass. Inside the room, the atmosphere was tranquil. A porcelain cup of room service coffee rested on a glass coffee table. I sat in a plush armchair, wearing a simple white robe, holding my digital tablet. The industry reviews were flooding the internet. Trade publications, music critics, and global news outlets were publishing their morning editions. They were not just discussing the vocal performance or the choreography. They were dissecting the stage design. A notoriously harsh critic from a premier entertainment magazine dedicated an entire column to the visual architecture. The author called the lighting synchronization and the carbon frame LED halo a revolutionary leap in live event production. The article specifically named Morgan architecture. It detailed how the industry had long suffered from a surplus of hollow visionaries and desperately needed the return of genuine technical builders. My name was printed in bold text across multiple platforms. The ghost had officially become a titan. I set the tablet down on the glass table. I did not feel the frantic, heart-pounding adrenaline that characterized Julian whenever he received a minor compliment. I felt a steady, grounding satisfaction. The math was correct. The foundation held. The world saw the exact truth I had built with my own 2 hands. The quiet tranquility of the hotel suite was suddenly interrupted. My personal cell phone, resting on the mahogany nightstand beside the bed, began to vibrate. The harsh mechanical buzzing resonated against the polished wood. I walked over to the nightstand and looked down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed a single name: Richard. My father was calling. The man who had spent the last decade communicating almost exclusively through his wife or via terse, passive text messages was initiating a direct phone call. He was the same man who sent me a cruel message just 3 weeks prior, blaming me for his wife's depression and his son's failure. I did not reach out to pick up the device. I stood motionless, watching the screen illuminate the dim corner of the bedroom. I let the phone ring. I knew exactly what was happening 3,000 miles away in California. The time difference meant it was early morning on the West Coast. I could picture the scene in their suburban living room with vivid, clinical accuracy. Richard and Sylvia were sitting on their floral-patterned sofa. The television was likely tuned to a national morning broadcast. The clips of Serena Vale pausing her concert, pointing to the soundboard, and demanding the audience recognize my labor had gone viral overnight. Social media platforms were saturated with high-definition videos of the spotlight cutting through the darkness to illuminate my face. The narrative of the hidden female engineer taking her rightful place on a global stage was a compelling human interest story. The media algorithms were pushing it to every screen in the country. My parents had watched the footage. They had seen 50,000 strangers rise to their feet in a deafening standing ovation for the daughter they had actively tried to erase. In that California living room, a profound psychological pivot was occurring. Their curated family mythology was dead. Julian, the golden boy who was supposed to elevate the Morgan name to the upper echelons of Los Angeles society, was currently preparing for his shift at a warehouse logistics desk. He was a disgraced, uncredited assistant, stripped of his leased luxury car and his fabricated prestige. He could no longer provide the social currency Sylvia required to impress her neighbors. Faced with the sudden, undeniable reality of my global success, my parents were experiencing a desperate urge to attach themselves to a winning narrative. They could not tolerate being ordinary, and they certainly could not tolerate being left behind by the child they had dismissed. If Julian could no longer serve as their gleaming trophy, they would simply reach under the bed, dust off the cardboard shoebox, and attempt to claim my trophies as their own. They needed to rewrite history. They needed to convince themselves and their shrinking social circle that my triumph was the direct result of their excellent parenting. The vibrating on the mahogany nightstand ceased. The glowing screen went dark for a fraction of a second, before illuminating again with a new notification. A voicemail had been recorded. I picked up the phone. I tapped the screen and held the speaker to my ear. I expected the familiar, rigid tone of a man delivering an instruction. I expected a continuation of the hostility from his last text message. Instead, the voice echoing through the small speaker was entirely foreign. Richard sounded shaky. The authoritative edge was gone, replaced by a synthetic, fragile warmth that he had clearly practiced before dialing. 80, sweetheart, we saw the video. The use of a childhood nickname was a tactical deployment, a clumsy attempt to manufacture an intimacy that never existed. I listened as he cleared his throat, pushing past his own discomfort to deliver the revisionist history. The whole neighborhood is talking about it, Richard continued, his voice trembling slightly. Your mother is in tears. We are just so proud. Call us back when you have a minute. We always knew you had it in you. The recording ended with a soft click. The automated prompt asked if I wanted to save or delete the message. I lowered the phone. I stood in the quiet luxury of the Manhattan suite, looking out the window at the towering skyscrapers. I replayed the final sentence in my mind. We always knew you had it in you. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of that statement hung in the air. They knew nothing. They had funded a fraud. They had ignored my high school theater designs. They had skipped my college graduation to load rented speakers for a nightclub gig. They had sat at an expensive steakhouse and told their neighbors that they do not brag about me. They demanded I sign a non-disclosure agreement to protect a thief. They had spent 30 years actively suppressing the very talent they were now trying to claim. A year ago, hearing that voicemail might have triggered a visceral reaction. I might have felt a surge of vindictive rage. I might have drafted a blistering, multi-paragraph text message detailing every single instance of their neglect, demanding an apology they were incapable of providing. I might have engaged in a bitter argument, hoping to finally force them to see the reality of their own cruelty. But standing in the morning light, I felt no anger. The heat of resentment had entirely burned away, leaving behind a smooth, untroubled detachment. When you finally realize that a person's perception of you is a reflection of their own limitations and not a measure of your actual worth, they lose their power to hurt you. My parents were not evil masterminds. They were just ordinary, deeply flawed people who prioritized their own comfort over their daughter's humanity. They were addicted to a delusion, and they were currently suffering the withdrawal symptoms of reality. I did not need to correct their narrative. I did not need to extract a confession or force them to acknowledge the pain they caused. Their punishment was not a dramatic confrontation. Their punishment was their own irrelevance. They had to watch my ascension from a distance, knowing they had forfeited their right to stand beside me. I looked at the phone screen. The automated prompt was still waiting for a command. I tapped the red icon. The voicemail was permanently deleted, erased from the digital memory, just as swiftly as their influence was erased from my life. I opened the contact menu. I navigated to my father's profile. I pressed the option to block the caller. I performed the exact same action for Sylvia's contact number. I finalized the administrative boundaries I had initiated weeks ago. The channels of communication were officially severed. There would be no holiday visits. There would be no forced, uncomfortable dinners. There would be no future opportunities for them to siphon my hard-earned light to illuminate their own shadows. The bridge between my past and my present was permanently burned, and I was the one holding the match. I set the phone back down on the nightstand. The device remained silent. I walked over to the plush armchair and picked up my digital tablet. I had a busy schedule ahead. Serena Vale's management team had requested a lunch meeting to discuss expanding my architectural role for the European stadium dates. Several other prominent touring artists had already reached out to my newly formed agency, requesting preliminary consultations. My calendar was filling up with legitimate, high-stakes engineering projects. I poured myself another cup of room service coffee. The dark roast was bitter and grounding. I took a slow sip, savoring the quiet autonomy of the morning. I had survived the domestic erasure. I had navigated the intellectual property theft. I had stood my ground against the financial manipulation. I had built a career that could withstand the scrutiny of a global audience. The narrative was finally my own, and the final chapter was waiting to be written. 6 months later, the California sun paints long, golden rectangles across the polished concrete floor of my office. The space sits on the top floor of a renovated industrial building in downtown Los Angeles. The glass double doors at the entrance bear a clean, minimalist frosted logo. The elegant letters spell out Morgan Architecture. I walk past the reception desk holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The drafting room hums with a focused, deliberate energy. I currently employ a staff of 12 highly specialized structural engineers, lighting programmers, and visual artists. I recruited them specifically from the shadows of the entertainment industry. They are the quiet workers, the individuals who spent years watching louder, charismatic people steal the credit for their late nights and rigorous math. In this building, authorship is a sacred concept. Every design file, every wireframe, and every staging rendering carries the true name of the person who actually built it. We do not employ visionaries here. We employ builders. The walls of my personal office serve as a silent testament to that specific philosophy. 3 framed platinum touring plaques hang proudly above my drafting table, commemorating the record-breaking domestic leg of Serena Vale's stadium run. They are not hollow trophies manufactured to impress suburban neighbors. They are historical records of gravity physics and art operating in perfect harmony. I sit down at my expansive desk and open a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Inside rests the final production contract for the European expansion of the tour. The logistical parameters are staggering and beautifully complex. We are adapting the core stage geometry to fit historic, centuries-old venues in London, Paris, and Berlin. I spend the morning verifying the freight weight calculations for the transatlantic cargo ships. I dictate my strict terms regarding the intellectual property clauses, ensuring my firm retains total legal ownership of the underlying software routing. The global promoters in London do not argue. They do not ask me to fetch coffee or dismiss me as a simple tech assistant. They sign the paperwork without hesitation because they require the unyielding architecture only I can provide. My desk intercom buzzes quietly. My operations manager, a sharp, pragmatic woman named Elena, informs me that Marcus is waiting in the main conference room. He flew in from Chicago specifically to review the updated pyrotechnic cues for the outdoor festivals. I walk into the meeting space and the veteran production manager greets me with a firm, respectful handshake. We spend 2 hours debating the descent velocity of the LED halo, factoring in the unpredictable wind variables of the European summer. There is zero ego in the room. There is only the mutual, relentless pursuit of structural perfection. I have finally found my true circle. They are a loyal, uncompromising network of seasoned industry veterans who respect the truth above all else. They know my history, and they guard my professional perimeter fiercely. That perimeter requires constant, vigilant maintenance. A profound shift in power does not erase a lifetime of family entitlement overnight. When you cut the supply line to a dysfunctional system, the system will eventually try to locate a back door. My primary cellular number remains changed. My digital servers automatically filter and delete any electronic correspondence originating from my hometown zip code. Since Richard and Sylvia cannot reach me directly, they occasionally attempt to deploy proxies. Last Tuesday, a padded envelope arrived via certified mail. The return address belonged to my Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister. I recognized the tactic immediately. It is a common strategy utilized by families that refuse to respect established boundaries. They enlist extended relatives to act as emotional couriers, hoping familiar guilt will bypass the blockade. I sat at my desk and examined the sealed package. 10 years ago, I would have opened it. I would have read the enclosed letter, torturing myself with their manipulated version of reality. I would have searched the ink for a single sentence of genuine accountability, only to find another heavy demand for my subservience. I would have allowed their manufactured crisis to derail my entire week. I did not open the envelope. I did not trace the edges of the paper or wonder what flavor of revisionist history Sylvia had dictated to her sister. The contents were entirely irrelevant. If the letter contained an apology, it was 30 years too late. If it contained a demand, it held zero authority. I carried the unopened package to the heavy-duty paper shredder stationed in the copy room. I fed the thick envelope directly into the steel blades. The machine whirred loudly, reducing their desperate proxy attempt to uniform strips of illegible confetti. I emptied the collection bin into the recycling receptacle, brushed my hands off, and went back to calculating the roof load capacities for a stadium in Germany. The physical act of disposal was not born of spite. It was a simple act of administrative hygiene. I was merely keeping my workspace clean. Julian's name occasionally surfaces in casual industry gossip, though the mentions grow increasingly rare with each passing month. The last credible rumor placed him working the logistics desk for a regional agricultural trade show in the Central Valley. His daily responsibilities involved tracking the arrival times of folding tents and portable generators. The boutique agency he tried to build using my brain is a dissolved entity reduced to a brief, embarrassing footnote in the corporate registry. His leased luxury vehicles and tailored velvet blazers are gone, replaced by the mundane reality he always believed he was too important to endure. I do not wish him further harm. I do not monitor his downfall or celebrate his current struggles. I just let him exist in the environment he earned. The consequences of intellectual property theft and fraudulent representation are cold and unyielding. The universe he occupies now is the exact size of his actual competence. As the afternoon sun begins to dip below the Los Angeles skyline, painting the walls of my office in deep shades of violet and gold, I sit back in my ergonomic chair. The quiet humming of the dual monitors provides a steady, comforting rhythm. I think about the 17-year-old girl sitting alone in a dark, empty high school auditorium. I think about the cardboard shoebox hidden beneath her bed, filled with certificates and programs no one ever bothered to look at. I wish I could tell her that she does not need to wait in the dark anymore. Looking back across the long, arduous road that led to this sunlit room, the patterns of survival become incredibly clear. I want to speak directly to you, the person listening to this story who might be sitting in their own version of that empty auditorium. I want to tell you what I had to learn the hard way. Silence is not peace. It is a down payment on someone else's comfort. When you bite your tongue to keep the fragile ecosystem of your family intact, you are not maintaining harmony. You are purchasing their temporary satisfaction using your own dignity as the currency. The people who demand your silence do not love you. They love the convenience of your compliance. Your worth is not determined by the people who demand you stay small so they can feel tall. A person who requires you to hide your brilliance so they can stand in the light is not a leader. They are a parasite. You cannot fix a toxic dynamic by shrinking yourself to fit inside it. The cage will only grow tighter. The best revenge is not an argument. It is a documented fact and a life lived brilliantly on your own terms. Debating a delusion only validates the person holding it. The ultimate victory is undeniable competence. It is walking away from the theater of their vanity and building a foundation so solid that no one can ever claim they carried you. You hold the power to stop auditioning for a role in a family play that was written specifically to humiliate you. You can drop the script. You can walk out the door. If you have ever stopped waiting for someone else's applause and learned to build your own stage, drop a comment below. Fade to black. When you look closely at the ruins of a collapsed family, you rarely find a single explosive detonation. Instead, you find a slow, quiet rot, a foundation built on uneven ground, stressed by years of invisible fractures. The story of Adelaide Morgan and her brother Julian is more than just a tale of stolen blueprints and stadium tours. It is a mirror held up to the quiet, sometimes devastating, realities of the traditional American family structure. It asks us to look at the living rooms where we raise our children and wonder, what kind of stage are we really building for them? At the heart of the Morgan family's unraveling was the dangerous allure of the family myth. Adelaide's parents, Richard and Sylvia, fell into a trap that ensnares far too many well-meaning parents. They wrote a script for their children before truly knowing who those children were. Julian was cast as the visionary, the golden boy destined for greatness, while Adelaide was relegated to the shadows, cast as the unremarkable worker bee. But favoritism is a double-edged sword that cuts both ways. By relentlessly inflating Julian's ego, without requiring him to develop real skills, they did not just hurt Adelaide, they crippled Julian. They raised a young man so dependent on external applause and so devoid of practical competence that he was willing to commit fraud to maintain his glamorous facade. A family must be a place where a child's unique identity is discovered and nurtured, not a casting agency where children are forced into predetermined roles. This dynamic speaks volumes about a modern cultural crisis, the overvaluation of surface appeal at the expense of genuine substance. We live in an era that frequently celebrates the charismatic networker who can talk their way into any room. Richard and Sylvia were captivated by Julian's leased Porsche, his velvet blazers, and his empty industry buzzwords. Meanwhile, they completely ignored the quiet, unglamorous reality of Adelaide's solid technical foundation. She found her peace in geometry, in load-bearing calculations, and in the rigorous math required to build something real. When the crushing pressure of a national stadium tour finally arrived, Julian's charm instantly crumbled, because charm cannot defy gravity. A healthy upbringing must focus on cultivating professional ethics and raw, undeniable competence. We must teach our children that the scaffolding of a successful life is built with calloused hands, not just a polished smile. But perhaps the most devastating failure in the Morgan household was the absence of emotional validation. The erasure of Adelaide's identity did not begin in a corporate boardroom in Los Angeles. It began in the empty chairs of her high school auditorium. A parent's presence at a recital, a game, or a graduation is not merely a scheduling commitment. It is the ultimate currency of love. It tells a child simply and profoundly, "I see you, and you matter." By repeatedly telling Adelaide not to be so needy, her parents starved her of the emotional investment required to build a secure bond. When a child feels invisible in their own home, the damage echoes for decades. Even after Adelaide single-handedly saved them from foreclosure, her parents could not bring themselves to acknowledge her brilliance because it meant admitting their own catastrophic failure. The resulting breakdown in their relationship was absolute and irreparable. That very foreclosure was born from another critical parenting failure, confusing enablement with love. In the name of supporting their son, Richard and Sylvia took the incredibly reckless step of taking out a $200,000 second mortgage to bankroll Julian's lies. They shielded him from the financial consequences of his own ineptitude, setting the entire family up for disaster. True familial responsibility means teaching children the value of a dollar and the necessity of self-reliance. It is no coincidence that Adelaide, who quietly paid her own rent and funded her own education, was the one who ultimately achieved absolute freedom. Shielding a child from reality does not prepare them for the world. It only ensures that when reality finally hits, it destroys everything in its path. Ultimately, shaping a child's future requires the humility to step back and let their natural aptitude lead the way. Parents frequently try to steer their children toward careers that seem prestigious or fulfill their own unlived ambitions. But a sustainable future can only be built upon a foundation of true passion. Adelaide found her calling not in the spotlight her mother coveted, but in the dark, complex architecture of live event production. Instead of dismissing a child's unique interests, parents must observe, listen, and provide the space for those strengths to flourish. The core truth we must carry away from the Morgan family is this: silence is not peace. Silence is merely a down payment on someone else's comfort. A healthy family structure must be grounded in fairness, self-respect, the recognition of genuine ability, and the establishment of clear boundaries. It must be a place where every child is given the tools to build their own stage in life, rather than being forced to stand as a prop on someone else's. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment of reflection with us. If this story resonated with you, or if you found pieces of your own history hidden within these lessons, please subscribe and follow the channel QT Told Stories. We explore the calm, dramatic truths of everyday life, and we would be honored to have you join our community. As the lights fade on Adelaide's journey, one question lingers in the quiet air of our own homes. When we look at the people we love most, are we truly seeing them for who they are? Or are we only seeing the reflection of who we desperately need them to be? The answer to that question might just be the blueprint for the rest of your life.